Right, so we're going to move on now to looking at project risk. I imagine there's some very, very complex ways that you do this, and I'm going to like to talk to you about really basic ways of doing it. So does anyone sort of want to share how on their project you go about doing this?
I can. It's quite by the book how we do it. I think the only aspect we probably don't have, which major projects probably do, is that we don't monetize the risk. So we say, you know, there is a financial risk, but we don't put a value on it. Essentially, at key stages in the project, so not just before and after project stages change, but after, in the run up to key milestones being completed. So about 6 months ago we did one. We just kind of finished all the procurement aspects and we were going into the approvals aspects. So, you know, for our use shift, we have a big or several risk workshops where we kind of just talk about the potential risks which are on our minds and, you know, what might happen. Then we go away, write them up properly, compare them to what's already on the risk register, and then bring them to our forums. If they're high, they have to go through our multidisciplinary team or our management group, depending on where we are, and then project board agree them. If not, it just stays at that lower level, and then we name an owner and a manager, and we push them quite heavily, but it's up to them to update the risks and keep an eye on them and escalate them where necessary, or close them where necessary, that sort of thing. So in our recent gateway, we got told we needed a few different risks around something and that they should be managed at a project board level. None of us, we kept hitting at our MDT, why are these going to be high? Why are these going to be high? Because we've been told that they need to be high.
So what was it? You were hitting your MDT?
Yeah, our multidisciplinary team. So it has to go through them first and then go up to project board. So at our multidisciplinary team, everyone was like, well, these all make sense, but I wouldn't call them high. But if you're telling us they have to be high, because our gateway assurance review team had told us that they had to be high, and that's something they're going to check on at next gateway, how we've managed them. And then we took them to project board, and project board were like, why are these high? These, you know, good risks, but we shouldn't be managing them here. So we're having to kind of walk a fine line on that one.
Do you do anything as basic as colour coding them? Or
oh yeah, so high, medium, and low. Low is green, medium is amber, red is high, and then they can escalate into issues. There's a kind of table graph, you know, boom, 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 where you have to assess the likelihood and the impact.
Yeah, so it's like
risk assessment. Yeah. That tells you what level it is.
And the likelihood versus impact, is that 1 to 5 or 1 to 10?
1 to 5.
Okay. And then is it called a RAG rating when you do that? Red, amber, green?
Yeah, I mean, we've got those colours and they're generally used. We don't tend to call them, because we call it high, medium and low rather than
yeah.
RAG, but it's the same thing, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I've seen other places where they do like heat maps for risk as well.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that. Do you do that?
We don't on our project, really.
Okay. That sounds really sensible. So there's like quite a high level of scrutiny of them, isn't there, in terms of like how they're presented and what's expected to be seen and manage them. Is there any other processes that anyone is sort of familiar with? Is there any other approach that you're having to do on your projects, or is that?
I think that's broadly the kind of process. I think with kind of major projects and highways in England, we have to use a tool called Exactium, which we input all of our risks into, and it calcs them. But I mean, in the projects I've done, and I think it's probably because I come from a product design environment, I utilize something called the FMEA, which is failure mode, analysis, and I use
Yes.
sometimes for my risk assessments depending on the type of project I'm working on, especially if it's kind of like a software development kind of program. I'll probably utilize an FMEA over a risk because it's a product.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a few things that you've mentioned today that are very much on the sort of quality side of it and the quality tools, because that's one of them, because I'm teaching quality for CMI tonight, and that's those sort of acronyms and things that you spent about are the ones that are used. That what you mentioned, was it a software or is it a process?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a software that takes kind of that process out of your hands. So you still do the identification piece and understanding the risk and the process, and then all that does is it takes into effect your kind of scoring mechanisms and puts them into a tool that then feeds back up into highways. And then I think that then what that tool kind of does is then gives them an overarching risk pool for all of the projects that are using that software, so they can see on a wider level as opposed to just individually.
Absolutely, yeah. No, that sounds, it sounds natural to have that sort of reporting procedure when you're so closely connected. In terms of risk, what do we reckon is going to cause us more problems? Is it going to be the technical side of it, so the things in the sort of slightly pink thing there, or is it going to be the socio-cultural, the people? Which do you think, which in your experience is the where most risk occurs?
Sorry, Steve. In construction work that we do, it's mainly technical. What is something going to turn up on site that you weren't expecting is going to cause delays, going to cost money to put right. So we just use a standard RAG-rated risk register, and them risks are carried to our month-end financial reporting. So if we've got a scheme, we've got a barrier scheme on at the moment, and you hope to drive the post, but if the ground's pooey, you might have to use concrete foundations. That slows things up. It costs more money, so you hold a risk pot against that in case it happens, and if it doesn't, fine. So that's how we do it. But you can get the sociological side can happen if people can fall out on site, or people can. You get change of personnel on site and things like that, so it can happen. But it probably will stem from a technical risk that's happened, and then people fall out over the best way to put it right.
Yeah. Do you think it depends on the nature of the project, because I think your work is in essence technical, isn't it, in terms of the delivery of certain things, whereas
ours is technical. So that the risk registers we produce are we do safety. So what hazards are there on for delivering the project, and then the financial risks against it.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Any examples of more of the socio-cultural side of it?
I have quite a lot. If I'm doing new things, I generally have a lot of issue with problem solving. I have quite a lot of risk allocated to kind of that leadership piece and getting people to understand that I need them on board, and I'm trying to do it for them and not just because I want to change the way that they're working. So I have quite a lot of risk for kind of upheaval and that change process.
Well, I was wondering, which ties into what you've both said really, I was wondering, actually, do you think the socio-cultural side is more at the beginning, because it's more about getting it going, taking it forward, getting people to buy in, understanding what the stakeholders, and then actually in terms of the delivery, the technical side, that's where it would flip more into the technical? Do you think that's potentially how it could work, or do you think there's some projects where it's going to be, I wonder if it, like HS2, maybe both all along?
I think in general that would probably work for the majority of the projects I work on.
Okay. So technically we make sure everything's specified correctly, and not just specified but actually delivered to what's been specified, and that's that is going to be really structured, whereas the people side of it, it's sort of getting people to buy into the change, and that's a real challenge because of so many different agendas, aren't there, and things that you don't always know as well. So sort of the whole thing with change management, have you heard of sort of Lewin's before, this idea where you to get people to move forward, you need to unfreeze a situation. So you need basically a stimulus to make it so uncomfortable, we've got to do something different. And then you create the change and then you freeze it. So you sort of have this idea of a 3-step process when you've got change. But it's almost like the pain needs to be shared sometimes and almost amplified to make people, if it's, when we talked about some of the sort of people who are landowners and there's an immediate impact, actually quite often that's going to have zero benefit, isn't it? So it's going to be challenging to get them to not necessarily buy in, but just not object necessarily to what's happening. Or so I think this is something that you could bring into it in terms of where we've got risk. And then there's also this idea that you're not going to get everything, so you can't get it, well, I think, unless we've got Stephen on our side, in which case it probably will be fast, cheap, because we've got less staff, Stephen, and then it's still going to be good. But generally, you can't have all of them, can you? Where is the emphasis, do you think, on the projects you've worked at? Which are the priorities if we're just looking at 2?
Cost and time.
Is the quality the trade-off then?
Usually they expect it for the cheapest price at the fastest time, and quality then doesn't become an issue until there's a quality issue, and then it's like, oh, we've actually forgot about quality and the governance processes that should be in place.
Or quality is picked up at the end.
Yeah.
Where you spend 3 years going through reading files.
Yeah.
When everyone's buggered off and you can't get any answers.
Oh no. So does the health and safety fit within the quality?
I think in our world, health and safety in the triple constraints almost is its own constraint in its own right, because health and safety has been made such a fundamental part of what we do. It doesn't come into quality. Health and safety, in my opinion, is almost its own thing and is accounted for already in the time and cost. So you always get, can you do it faster? Can you do it cheaper? But not at the detriment of health and safety.
Yeah.
I think almost in this triangle, health and safety is almost its kind of own little thing.
Okay.
And really sit within the quality. When I think of quality in the work that we do, that's governance and processes and reporting, not health and safety.
Yeah. Okay. And then this was, for those of you that haven't ever seen a sort of the visual of a risk assessment, this is where we've got the sort of the likelihood versus impact, and they're rated from 1 to 5, with, is 1 the lowest, Claire, and then 5 the highest in terms of very low to very high?
Yeah, that's in our way anyway.
Yeah, and you're sort of given a number percentage, and then if it's green, it's sort of acceptable. If it's it's the great, and then we need mitigation plans. But what's missing on here is actually what the risks are, which you'd have at one side, and then potentially, if you wanted to keep it quite small, you'd then have a mitigation plan, which may actually include accepting a risk, because actually even if the likelihood of it happening is very high, but the impact is very low, it's still, or if the impact's high, for example, in what we're seeing there, but no, sorry, which one am I doing? So likelihood is high, but the impact is very low, it's acceptable still. So actually some risk we may accept, some risk we pass on to suppliers, because actually they need to be insured against it. And even things like places where the canteen is outsourced or security, part of that is around passing out the risk of them being sued for certain things, just so that they're keeping their risk at a manageable level. In terms of sort of discussing this with so we can do we come up with a plan around it. So we either work out a way to reduce it or the impact. Can anyone give me an example? Can we try and think of examples for each of these four when they might happen?
Yeah, using the using the scheme I'm delivering at the moment, the barrier scheme, you can you can we did some on-site testing prior to the scheme starting, so we did some push testing on the barrier post prior to getting onto site, so you can sort of mitigate the risk by knowing what ground conditions you're likely to get when you actually arrive on site. So you can price then for concrete, a certain percentage of concrete footings.
Okay.
That sorts of avoids the risk. I don't know whether you could transfer it. I suppose you're almost
avoiding it. We need to change something completely, don't we? So how could we avoid? So that does mitigate it because we've sort of reduced it, because you know what you're dealing with, don't you? Avoiding it. Can we think of something that?
Would this be one? It's we're redoing the website, and GDS wanted us to have to disaggregate it further so that we had a separate website provider, and then the packages feeding in the info sitting behind. And I don't necessarily agree with how the project did it, but they decided no, to keep the website within the packages because the risk of the website going down and losing the revenue was too high, even though the risk was really very low. They avoided the risk essentially of that because of the insurance purposes. The little website owners wouldn't have been able to cover the revenue lost with their insurance.
Okay. Or is that, or is it transferring? Did they transfer the risk?
It's a bit of both, really. We changed the way we did it, but in doing so, we transferred the risk. The obvious one would be the GDPR one we were talking about, where we highlighted the issues and made sure the data controller and the roles were clear, so that we do transfer the risk onto the suppliers. That way.
I think there's very few examples that are really, really clean in the sense of avoiding the risk, because I think there's some level
risk.
Unless you're sort of, the only things I can think of where you actually physically move something to avoid something happening, you go to a different area, or you do. It's when you're operating within a number of constraints, I think you have to accept a certain level.
The way that we would avoid.
Go on, yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say the way that we avoid risk is just design change.
Oh, okay. Yep. Yeah. That's a simple. Well, not a simple, but a very straightforward example. Thank you. Yeah. So it doesn't happen then. And then when would we decide to retain the risk that we're keeping it, but we're managing it? Can you think of examples where that might happen?
That might be where the investigation works prior to a scheme starting is so extensive and so they'll be so costly and time consuming that you'd rather just get to site and retain some risk against that, because it may end up being the most cost effective way.
Well, yeah, and actually, especially if it's a sort of the likelihood's quite low, and the impact's not particularly high, you might, actually, do you know what? It's going to cost us so much to sort that, that we might as well just accept it might happen. If it does, we'll deal with it then. And it's not in a sort of blasé way, but it's in quite a calculated way. That's sometimes the strategy that's the most practical, really. So we've got lots of different potential risks where things might not go to plan. Financial seems to be interesting. That Claire, you were saying that actually that's financial is listed as a risk, but actually not necessarily quantified, weren't you?
Just I know there's Axiom one. It looks like you do have to put in how much it will cost should it come to pass, and obviously on the tenders they've got the risk pots which they've assigned values to, but within our internal project risk register, it as long as it's all within budget and stuff, it's just that's enough of a deterrent to avoid the risk and mitigate it.
Yeah, and then yeah. So yeah, depending on what level of reporting you've got, it may be quantified, it may not be. You've talked about so many other risks here. I think you've got a thorough sort of potential, you know, that you can relate to your project. And then we've also talked about, you know, 4 main strategies. And sometimes it can be a risk that in any of the contracts, is that a risk that's with your relationships with your supplier? Do any of you actually share the risk, or is it entirely transferred?
We share some of it.
Give me an example. Are you able to give an example of where it might be shared?
No, but only because I can't remember.
Yeah,
I wasn't involved in drawing it up, but there's a little matrix about where certain big financial risks lie, and whether it's lies with the suppliers or
Okay. And then the other Claire mentioned this, didn't you, failure mode effects analysis? So this sort of idea of looking at where potential risk may occur, isn't it? Is that the sort of thinking behind it?
Yeah, it's also looking at kind of the opportunities as well that you can take from it. So if X was to happen, how bad is it? And is it gonna, you know, is it a massive health and safety breach? Yes. Okay, then we need to mitigate that. No. Okay, we can just leave it and see if it should happen.
Yeah. Yeah, so when to act and when not to, isn't it? Because again, it's just this idea of having a finite time and energy resource. You know, we can't act on everything, otherwise we'd never get anywhere. So what's acceptable and what isn't? Another thing we can do is almost look at the sort of, there's different ways we do it. Cost benefit analysis is when we're looking at potential way forwards. What's the cost going to be? What are the benefits in terms of financially, but also are there wider benefits? And actually, how do we decide to move forward in terms of actually are the benefits outweighing the costs, which isn't easy to do if some of the benefits are non-financial, because you're not able to weigh everything up, like it's almost like your pros and cons list, but actually if you can't assign values to everything, that's going to be quite difficult to use, especially if some of the non-financial ones in particular have got quite a high value in other ways. And then there's another thing called scenario planning, where you imagine, you know, if A happened, what would we do if B happened? So we sort of build different pictures of the future based on different things happening, and that could be another way that we almost then create an idea as to, in this scenario, what risks are presented to us. So these are sort of bigger picture things that we can use. I know this is quite good because it sort of looks at where we're going to have challenges at different stages of the project. So when we're starting the project off in this sort of initiation, the procedures and the priorities are the biggest risks. The priorities get even bigger as a risk in the early stages, so what we're doing first in the schedule. And then it's all about schedules and technical opinions in the main project are the main ones, and resource then. And then actually towards the end, it's the pressure on time on the schedule that seems to be the biggest, but all the others seem to have sort of quite similar weighting. It's sort of good because I think risk changes as you go throughout the project. There's different pressures on the project as you go along, aren't there? And there's going to be different levels of scrutiny. And to start off with, it's the forming stage, isn't it, where we're sort of all on the same hymn sheet and sort of agreeing what the priorities are, which is the formation to the early stages. So just on this risk one, right, how many words have we got for this? We've got 325. So we're looking at identifying and managing risks. So actually, what are the risks? What are the cost benefits of those? What are the alternatives we've got? And there's some options there in terms of upskilling staff. We've got improving, so over to Lee, our ICT systems and procedures. We've got sort of how are we going to monitor the risks? How are we going to, I mean, when Paul, you were giving your example, almost like the stress testing before you even get there in terms of what the barriers, what will they take? So we're sort of working out what we're dealing with to start off with. Then we're working out actually what we're going to do if we need to get rid of some of that risk. So can we transfer it over? Can we use insurance policies, because sometimes that might be the most cost effective way. So we're accepting it still might happen, but actually if it does happen, we're covered financially. But are there other contingencies that we could use? You know, how do we totally avoid the risk? So we might do a redesign of something. How do we minimize it? So I think hopefully on this one, this will be again very, very individual to your particular situation. I think the sort of the RAG rating, the issues versus the likelihood versus the impact, and rating that could be a nice one to apply to your project, just with a couple of samples. Because if you did that with a couple of examples, you could then give examples of where it's of identifying and managing them. And then you could choose a couple of them which you were going to look at how you mitigate those risks. So I think you could that could be quite a word effective way of doing it, by using the risk ratings or matrix as a starting point for your 325 words. So let me just capture that as well in terms of just shutting down the recording.